Joining me now are Matt Duss, Executive Vice President at the Center for International Policy in Washington, D.C., and a former senior advisor on foreign policy to Senator Bernie Sanders, and Karim Makdisi, Associate Professor of International Politics at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. But he joins us today from Paris. Thank you both for joining me on the show. Much to discuss. Karim, let me start with you. What is your reaction to recent events in Lebanon? Obviously, people were worried about an escalation in Lebanon for the past 11 months. Israel's been threatening one, but we had the pager attack, and then on Monday, 550 people killed in a day.
Yes, it's absolutely awful what's going on in Lebanon. People have been waiting for the past several months for something to possibly escalate like this. And this attack on last Monday was absolutely shocking, with 500 people killed, as you're saying, and it's been several hundred killed since then, with many thousands wounded. There's been a massive displacement. I know from friends and others where a lot of people are heading to Beirut from the south and from the Bekaa. A lot of people heading north as well. So there's this great anxiety, great fear about what might happen, and a sense of foreboding that there doesn't seem to be any kind of end in sight. People are, in a sense, people are used to Israeli attacks. People are used to Israeli invasions, the idea of invasion, the idea of Israeli attacks, the idea of Israeli violence. But after the genocide and the kinds of language and the kinds of words that are being used by the Israeli leaders, Netanyahu and others, there is genuine fear going around.
Matt, were you surprised at the sheer ferocity of the Israeli assault? It's the single biggest day of killing in Lebanon since the end of the civil war in 1990, I believe.
Yeah.
Over 500 dead in a day, even by Israeli standards.
Yes, right.
Even by the standards of Gaza,
Yes.
500 dead in a day.
Right, no, I was surprised, and that's saying a lot. What we've seen over the past 11 months really just defies belief, really unprecedented, I think, in this century in terms of modern warfare, the amount of destruction. But the ferocity of the strikes this week were staggering.
And Karim, I've got to ask the question right at the outset before we get into the weeds on this. The Israeli argument is that Hezbollah attacked us on October the 8th. Hezbollah came after us. We were minding our own business when it came to Lebanon. So we've been forced by Hezbollah to do this. What is your response to that line of argument that you hear not just from Israel, but a lot of people in the media here?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that that history did not begin on October 7 or October 8. There's a very long context of Israeli attacks, Israeli invasions. Israel remains in occupation of Lebanese territory to this day. It remains, in a sense, to many, an existential threat to Lebanon. So while Hezbollah did initiate an attack, it initiated on October 8 in the Golan Heights, or in areas, Shebaa Farms, that Lebanon claims is its own territory occupied. The Syrians claim it's Lebanese territory. The Israelis say it's Syrian-occupied territory. But either way, that first day, the reaction was towards occupied Shebaa Farms. And then, of course, it escalates after that, back and forth. So the answer is there's a long history there, and the solution has to take into account that long history.
And Matt, in terms of long histories, obviously Americans aren't very good when it comes to long histories, whether it's American elites or the American public. When you look at what's happening with Lebanon right now, from a DC perspective, you had Joe Biden say, my red line is Rafah. Netanyahu trampled all over that red line, destroyed Rafah in many ways. Then he said, well, regional escalation, that's another red line. Like, we're not going to support you. There were all these leaks from the administration. We're not going to support you if you pick a fight, beyond Gaza.
Yeah.
They've picked a fight beyond Gaza. There's an argument that they want to escalate to Iran, and we'll come to that. What is going on in Washington, D.C.? You're here. You've worked in this town on foreign policy for a long time. You've worked in Congress. What calculations are going on right now in the White House, in Congress?
Right. I mean, to back up, what you said about the red line, I think is right. I mean, President Biden laid down a red line on Rafah, but it became clear that the real red line was that regional escalation. We've seen the U.S. engage in strikes on Iran-backed groups, especially after the strike on the Jordanian facility that killed several American service members. And they opposed the Rafah invasion until it became clear that that invasion could be carried out without spilling into Egypt. So they have themselves admitted that the humanitarian impact, the number of deaths and displaced in the Rafah Rafah operation was as bad or worse than they feared, but as long as it was contained within Gaza, as you said, Netanyahu rolled right over it. The challenge we have now is almost a year into this, whatever President Biden might say about what he wants or doesn't want, he refuses and has refused all along to impose any costs on Netanyahu. And until that equation changes, Netanyahu is going to continue what he's doing, which is prolonging, sustaining, and expanding this war for his own political purposes. Again, it is very clear that that is what is driving this. Israeli officials themselves have acknowledged this. The president himself, apparently, reportedly, privately, has acknowledged that he understands that Netanyahu knows his only path to staying in political power and avoiding the reckoning for October 7th it is to sustain this war.
Karim, as Matt says, it is very clear to everyone, both in Washington, D.C. and in Tel Aviv, what Netanyahu is doing for his own personal political calculations and gain. But he benefits, does he not, from having opponents in Gaza and Lebanon, Hamas and Hezbollah, which are designated foreign terrorist groups in places like the United States and the UK, which, in the case of Hamas on October 7th, did carry out war crimes. He benefits from having these groups. What is the view on the ground in somewhere like Lebanon? We've talked a lot on the show about Gaza, Palestinians, the right to resistance. Where does Hamas fit into all of this? What about Hezbollah? Explain to our viewers what role they play inside of Lebanon, because sometimes you hear people saying, well, they're a mainstream political movement, they've been part of the government, they're very popular with Shia communities, it's a divided country. But then you also see polling that says actually they're really unpopular with the Lebanese, who see them as a state within a state. Give us some background on how they're seen historically, but also right now in the middle of this conflict.
Yeah, so of course this is a very complicated question with also a long history, but the idea is that there is division. So the idea is that Hezbollah did emerge as a resistance group basically comes to be in 1985, but after the Israeli invasion in 1982. So it came after Israeli invasion. I think that's one very important point. So it was a reaction to Israeli invasions and occupation of Lebanon and of southern Lebanon, and that's when Hezbollah kind of came about, and then increasingly became the dominant resistance group. It used to be several resistance groups, and Hezbollah became the dominant one, and then became increasingly professionalized and strong in the 1990s onwards. So that's one part. It is extremely popular among its own community in southern Lebanon, in the Bekaa and other areas. And now, I would say over the past year, any kind of sectarian tensions that might have existed has also been kind of, I would say, weakened, because in the end, Hamas and Palestinians are largely Sunni Muslims and Christians for that matter. And so the Hezbollah is seen as the only real force, along with the Houthis, the Yemenis, who are really helping in fighting this Israeli aggression and trying to get a ceasefire. Ultimately, all of these groups are trying to get at the end of the genocide in Gaza and a ceasefire in Gaza. They've all said over and over and over, and Hassan Nasrallah has said it again last week in his most recent speech, that everything stops when there's a ceasefire and the end of genocide. That's it. I mean, there's a very clear point. So there is, and I don't want to say that, but there is division in Lebanon. A lot of people blame Hezbollah for a kind of dragging Lebanon into the war. And they don't particularly want to be kind of connected to the larger question of Palestine and the larger Palestine issue politically, although there's huge sympathy and empathy for Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank. Some in Lebanon feel like that this should be separated from Lebanon. For my part, I think you cannot separate Lebanon, and especially South Lebanon, from what's going on in the larger Palestine question in Gaza. It's impossible.
Matt, you're saying that's right. Karim mentioned Houthis there. When Israel says we're being attacked on multiple fronts by Iran-backed groups, by the Houthis, by Hamas, by Hezbollah, and someone like Karim says, well, actually, they all say end the genocide and we'll stop this. The Houthis have said that for a while. The counter comes, well, you can't trust these groups. That's a very naive, simplistic view of the world. But could it be that simple, that if you stop the killing in Gaza, a lot of this goes away?
No, there is obviously a larger regional context here. Some of these groups, they have relationships with Iran, some of which are much closer, as with Hezbollah, some not so close, as with the Houthis. But it seems pretty clear that Gaza is the crisis that is driving this right now. So yes, once you end the Gaza war, you do have a range of other problems that you still need to deal with, a range of other conflicts and tensions. But really, the Gaza catastrophe, it is what is driving this crisis right now. And we just, there's an effort by the Israelis, by Netanyahu, and by some in the United States to try and de-link these things, but we cannot.
Do you think that the people who are doing the delinking in DC, Matt, they're doing that through ignorance, or they know? Like, is the guy sitting inside the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House National Security Council, is that guy, he knows that this is all interlinked, and that if we stopped one, we would stop the rest. But he can't say it because the political atmosphere doesn't allow him.
By and large, I think people know. But you do have, you have a faction in Washington, a very influential one that is just fundamentally committed to backing what Israel wants at any given time. Some who seem, particularly committed to Netanyahu. Some are acting, I think, in good faith. They are committed to the security of Israel, but the way that they support that in policy, we all see the results. Right? I mean, this Gaza war, the context of it comes in years and decades of U.S.-backed impunity in the occupied territories. That is what created the context for the attacks, the horrific attacks of October 7.
Karim, what would you say to a supporter of Israel who says, well, hold on, you can, yes, 1982, Hezbollah, yes, 2006 even, but right now, Israel was minding its own business, and it's Lebanon that's in violation of UN Resolution 1701, which calls for Hezbollah to be disarmed, which they were not disarmed. What's your response to that line of argument?
Well, the line of argument is quite simple. Israel is in occupation of southern Lebanon, parts of southern Lebanon to this day. The Israeli overflights and breaking of Lebanese sovereignty since 2006, that is when the UN Resolution 1701 came about. They've had the overwhelming number of overflights and drones and incursions and other matters, much more so than the other way around. Even in this war, I think around 70-75% of all projectiles, as the UN and others have recorded them, have come from the Israeli side, not from the Hezbollah side. Yeah. So there is an overwhelming number, than just the sheer number. If you take a number, it's very clear that the Israelis first of all, project much farther into Lebanon. They have a long history of invasions and incursions of violence. I didn't see Lebanon invading Israel. I don't see Lebanon as this massive threat for the Israelis, at least up until very recently. And Hezbollah, as I said, it's been very clear, as has the Lebanese government, to be sure, that as long as there's a ceasefire, we will stop. And Hezbollah said it, the Lebanese government has said it, the foreign minister said it, the prime minister has said it, every single group in Lebanon has said it. So it's not that, politics, people can believe or not believe, but it's been very clear and very consistent.
It's interesting you mentioned, Karim, the Lebanon has not invaded Israel. And of course, that's true. And the Israelis would say, well, it's not about Lebanon, right? It's not about Hezbollah, it's about Iran. Iran is the real threat, the existential threat. They are backing these groups. How much do you think what we've seen over the past couple of weeks, from the pager attack to obviously this week's assault, people are talking about a ground invasion, how much of that is Israel trying to drag Iran into this war, into open conflict? Because you had the president of Iran at the UN General Assembly saying, look, we may have to respond. We may have to get directly involved, which they haven't really ever done for their proxies in recent years or ever.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't call them proxy. We can talk about that, but yes, I think
that's a good point. I'm using Western media lingo. What would you call the relationship?
Well, they call themselves part of the axis of resistance. So they're kind of partners with Iran, obviously, as the biggest partner and the one that provides the biggest support to all these different groups. But I'm not sure, for example, you can say the Houthis are proxies of Iran, and Hezbollah, maybe went from being some former proxy. It has expanded much more. It's become a lot bigger than simply being called a proxy. So, so I think this kind of language that always gets appeared in Western media,
yes,
as well as the dehumanization, not you, of course, but in general, the kind of Western media, there's a huge amount of dehumanization. And we see it being echoed all the time by Israeli leaders, Israeli, settlers, groups, and also in the media, that there's no distinction between Hezbollah and the residents, for example, in South Lebanon, in the Bekaa. So yes, just like in Gaza, just like in the West Bank, wherever you identify, or the Israelis identify what they call a terrorist, they're able to kind of destroy it at any length and kill as many babies and children and women and men. I mean, men also killed that are not necessarily Hezbollah fighters. So I think it's a really important kind of point. But on the question of Iran, yeah, I think this is an attempt by Netanyahu to spark a war in Lebanon, to get Hezbollah to do a much more radical response, which they can do. They're still being very restrained, in order to then drag in Iran into this and get the Americans, involved in this war once and for all. I think this is a very clear kind of objective that Netanyahu wants. And what I think is really interesting to kind of point out is that Hezbollah is aware of this. The Iranians are quite aware of this, and they've gone out of the way not to respond in a way that might provoke the Israelis into this and sort of let them call on to their American kind of patrons to say, you see, now we're going to come in. They've been very restrained. Hezbollah is taking the blows kind of militarily. The pager thing, for example, that was an act of terrorism by the Israelis, mostly on civilians, frankly. I mean, even those that they claim to be Hezbollah people, these are kind of low-level Hezbollah kind of, let's say, public administration people. These are not the fighters. Anybody who thinks these are the fighters who walk around with pagers, I mean, they don't know how Lebanon works. They don't know that Hezbollah is a very big institutional organization with civil society and institutions and and medics and ambulance people and all sorts of kind of younger and older people who are just they're part of the administration in a sense. And that attack, by the way, was deliberate. It was the first attempt to deliberately maim. They didn't even want to kill. They wanted to maim and blind people across these several thousand people. So it is a pure act of terrorism. And these are the kinds of things, ironically, where those that deeply oppose Hezbollah in Lebanon become a lot more sympathetic. So the amount of empathy for people in general, the amount of support for the resistance as distinct from Hezbollah, the party itself, has grown a lot in Lebanon. The kind of displaced, the refugees that are coming out, the heavy-handedness, the sheer murderous, attacks by the Israelis in Beirut and across the country are making it clear that people have to support the resistance, even if they deeply oppose Hezbollah on other kind of fronts.
It's a very good point, and we've seen this movie before, Matt, in The War on Terror, where, quote unquote, the War on Terror, which was a war of terror in many ways, and which emboldened a lot of groups and pushed a lot of people in the Middle East who should have been on our side, quote unquote, onto the side of our opponents because of the nature of how we fought. Has the United States, A, learned any lessons from its war on terror? And B, is it trying to impart any of those lessons to the Israelis?
Well, that's really interesting because President Biden, as you might remember, in the days and weeks after October 7, when he was, demonstrating his support for Israel, which again I think was appropriate, especially in the wake of that attack, said specifically, I'm trying to help them understand some of the lessons we learned after 9/11. Don't make our mistakes, and yet they're making worse mistakes. And the United States and President Biden himself is backing those mistakes unconditionally. So I'm very sorry to say it does not seem that, this city, many in this city have. I think there's been more criticism of this policy than we've seen in the past. But I'm really frustrated to see that so many in this city have not learned those lessons.
A lot of people watching this will wonder, especially globally, why can people in Washington, D.C. not see what everyone else in the world sees? As I say, you've been part of the bureaucracy, you've been in Congress, you're in a think tank in D.C. I think it's too simplistic just to say, it's AIPAC, right? It's a lot of factors.
That's right.
What kind of factors are we talking here? Military-industrial complex, kind of the blob, as Ben Rhodes identified, kind of lazy, conventional wisdom thinking. What is it Joe Biden being a Zionist in his gut? Like, what are the just briefly explain to us, what are the multiplicity of factors that make Washington, D.C. so impervious to the arguments that seem to work everywhere else? Macron comes out and says the occasional sensible thing. The British government occasionally comes out, but not in D.C.
I mean, first of all, it's really hard to overstate the impact of a president who's setting the tone as Joe Biden has, which is just full support for Israel and little, if any, acknowledgement of the humanity of the Palestinians, their value as human beings. I think we have seen this time and time again. And it's partially the avoiding disagreement with the leader of your party. I mean, this is not just a foreign policy problem. Any party, politicians in that party are by and large going to be very hesitant to break with the leader and their party, and he has set this tone. Now, that has not been total. We certainly have seen people in the Congress who've had the courage to disagree and criticize.
All Democrats, by the way.
All Democrats,
no Republicans.
Of course, all Democrats. Part of it is just who the people we have kind of informing us in the major media, they tend to have a particular ideological bent on this as well, or else they just don't know very much about it, and so the people they are trying to learn from aren't giving them the best information. And I think we also have to acknowledge that a lot of this is just careerism. There are boundaries that are set those boundaries are changing. Again, I think the conversation we are having about these issues is different and in many ways better than we've been having in the past. But there is still a very real caution, especially for younger and maybe mid-level foreign policy professionals who have their eye on that future job in the administration and don't want to create problems for themselves down the road because they have seen how careers have been destroyed by people who take Palestinian lives too seriously.
What's so insane to me...
For people who take Palestinian lives too seriously.
What's so insane to me, Matt, is that it is very clearly going to hurt the Democrats domestically if this continues to escalate. We are a month or two away from the election, month and a half, whatever, I can't keep track of the date anymore. Countdown to disaster. And there's no scenario in which a Middle East regional war involving America supporting Israel against Iran helps Kamala Harris. Is there?
No,
it's insane.
I agree.
It's self-harming for the Democrats.
I think this is, the Biden administration's, calculation clearly was that Americans wouldn't really care. I think, Vice President Harris, obviously has taken a bit more of a forward-leaning approach on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. I think that's important. I think it is notable that she lifted up the Palestinians and their right to self-determination in the convention speech. She didn't go as far as many of us wanted. But still, the fact that that was a short speech that checked a number of boxes, that was a box she felt she needed to check. So I think we should take that as an acknowledgement of this party, and that's a growing constituency in the party. But yes, the fact that she has not signaled more of a break from Biden's approach here, I think that's going to be a problem. It may be a problem at the margins, but this election is going to be very close. It will be decided on the margins, and this could make the difference.
Karim, last question to you. Matt's explaining how the war in Gaza and now a war in Lebanon and possibly a war with Iran could hurt the Democrats, which they don't seem to understand, bizarrely. Just talk to me about the regional implications of Iran, Israel, and possibly the United States actually getting into a full-on war, which we've talked about, worried about, I think, going back to 2003 in the Iraq War. What would be the fallout from Iraq? And we've managed to avoid full-on conflict with Iran going through the Obama, Trump, and now Biden presidencies. But with a month and a bit to go, are we on the verge of a full-scale war involving Iran?
Well, can I just say firstly that in the region and otherwise, we should have no doubt that as far as people are concerned, the US is fully complicit with the genocide in Gaza. This is understood, the weapons that come through, the support, the surveillance, and everything else. So it's not just indirect, but people consider it as well to be kind of direct support. And this is going to have humongous impact in terms of U.S. standing and its role in the region. This will never go away, no matter what happens and no matter when the ceasefire eventually comes. It's now viewed as complicit in Lebanon. That's also quite clear. When now everybody in Lebanon is just everybody's talking about this aid or whatever it is, $9 billion that the U.S. has just promised the Israelis now in the middle of this invasion, which for people there clearly is like, oh, they're going to use it all to dump more weapons into Lebanon. So the signaling of the American administration when it comes to Palestine, Lebanon, at least these two countries, is very, very clear and very much complicit. Now, in terms of the war itself with Iran, yes, this would be catastrophic to everybody. It'll be catastrophic to everybody, obviously, as Matt is saying, including, I think, this administration. And it's impossible for anybody to understand how the Democrats can shoot themselves in the foot by continuing to support, by not even, we don't hear Kamala Harris, to be honest. She, as far as people are concerned, she's folded into the Biden. I think there was one or two statements very early on when she was trying to cut what was perceived to be carrying kind of support and people in Michigan and things like this. She kind of, said a couple of things about the humanitarian situation, but that's gone completely quiet since then, as far as we can tell, and as far as the messages that we're getting. So she's now considering to be back to being complicit fully with the Biden administration policy. And I think this is important to sort out. And if they allow this to kind of continue, if they allow Netanyahu to continue his adventure in Lebanon, to continue to kill people, because we all know, we've been there, 2006 war, this is following the same exact playbook as 2006, where the Israelis kind of hit civilians and they try to hit Hezbollah targets, and then they'll run out eventually of Hezbollah targets, and then they expand their attacks on civilian targets outside of areas where there can even be claimed to be kind of Hezbollah people. More civilians will be killed, and you end up kind of dragging different actors in, more catastrophe. And in the meantime, the news, the media, the politicians are forgetting about Gaza, which is the center of this. You need to always go back to Gaza, because a ceasefire, the ending of the Gaza genocide, will end all this. There is no other short-term solution. The longer term we can talk about. In the short term, the only thing that will end it is either the total destruction of Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran, everybody, or simply a ceasefire in Gaza.
I think it's a very good point. The short term is stopping the killing, which is also my position. As John Maynard Keynes once said, in the long run, we're all dead. So let's focus on the short term. Karim, Matt, thank you both for your analysis. Much appreciated. Thank you for your time. Thanks. Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to Zeteo.com. Your support matters.